Hello, everyone. We're live. Sorry, I was a few minutes late. I was really early. I was sitting here and then got on the internet and lost track of time. So now we're back. We are going to be talking about cycles today and some very basic stuff about how to get them set up. We might have talked about cycles earlier. I don't remember, but this might be the first time we've talked about it. So, cycles in Blender. It's Blender's fancy lighting system. And cycles showed up a little while ago in Blender. It wasn't always part of Blender, but one of the biggest complaints that had been surfacing about Blender over the years was its lack of we'll call it a professional lighting system built into the software, much like V-Ray or Mental Ray or any number of other softwares that come with the top 3D programs. And you really don't get to be part of the party with the big 3D programs unless you've got yourself a really fancy, good rendering system to show off the work. Now, a little bit of small print. As far as game assets go, we only care about the rendering engine enough to, well, A, see our assets the way that they're meant to be seen in game. Maybe, sometimes. And to render the thing so that we can put it in our portfolios or whatever it is. We just want to make the game asset look nice sometimes. The lighting from Blender isn't going into your game. So as far as which lighting engine you really use, it doesn't matter. Only the asset and its textures and its data is going into your game engine eventually. So the light's going to be left behind. So that's why we don't spend a whole lot of time on it. But it really wouldn't seem like it was a 3D class unless we talked about lighting of some sort so things can look nice when you want them to look nice. So a few other notes about cycles before we get into the how to set it up part. It's different than Blender's internal rendering engine, and without jumping out here and looking at it, the the internal rendering engine is pretty basic. It doesn't do a whole lot. Cycles is unbiased, so it's physically based and it's path tracing. And all that fancy talk means that it can render a whole lot better because it's going to basically bring in more information for your computer or Blender to make sense of when it's trying to render your scene. Also, probably doesn't matter to anybody, but it's interesting. It's Cycles is a backwards path tracer. So there's forwards and backwards path tracers. Blender's Cycles is backwards, which means that it traces light rays by sending them from the camera instead of sending them from the light sources. So the light actually doesn't emit from your light it isn't calculated to emit from your light until it hits the camera. That would be forward based. Backwards based means that it goes from the camera backwards. And usually you have to do that with the higher end rendering, or else it would take forever. Anyways, just you can win it. Jeopardy on that. So if you're wondering, the internal engine is rasterized. It's a rasterized engine, which means that it works by calculating which objects are visible to the camera and not by simulating the behavior of light. So that's why something like Cycles is probably going to be a little bit better. Neither is good or bad. It just means they're different. But if we were doing animation or film, we'd probably only be using Cycles. I don't think the internal engine would hold up well enough for us. So before we get started, the basic rules are: if you're on YouTube, you can watch for free. You just can't chat with us. I know there's some of you. I have been checking in the YouTube channel, and there's some of you showing up there. If you'd like to be a part of the club, you can go over to GameInstitute.com and look for that beta site button on the front page. Click that, and then look for our chat room. and you can follow us there. And anything that you type in, I will see, albeit eventually, and we can talk about it. If you've got any questions, it doesn't need to be about what we're covering here. You can ask really anything about any program too. Some programs I know more than others. I did get an email if we were going to be covering other programs besides Blender. We will. We have been. Photoshop, of course, is in the mix. We also looked at Quixel. Quixel just released version 2.0. And there was originally some stuff scheduled for this week in Quixel. I spent all this morning working with 2.0 for another project. And I think I am up and running enough in Quixel 2.0 to start doing some streams on it. So I put in, I think, one segment next week on Quixel, and we will see more PBR stuff the following weeks. By then I should have plenty of stuff up and running to show you in it. We've also got a segment, I believe it's Thursday night, on ZBrush this week. Just taking a look at some really cool ZBrush stuff. That's something I want to do more of, is instead of just covering a skill, taking a look at really cool 3D artwork in different programs. So we're going to try that. We also had our dinosaur anatomy, which I believe was Friday. I think it was Friday. And I thought that one went really well. I wish I had been recording it live. I wasn't because I was lazy. But we are doing a horse anatomy and a bird anatomy. Those are coming up in the next couple weeks. And we will start working back in some more 3ds Max stuff. I just found out I'm on the beta test for 3ds Max. Well, I guess they'll call it 3ds, but Max 2017. And wasn't really my choice. I got put on that by another company that I work for, and they wanted me up and running in the Max 2017 quickly. So yay, I guess. Hope it doesn't break my computer. And so we will be taking a look at least Max 2016. I don't think I could probably show you 17 until it's official. But, so we've got all sorts of cool stuff coming up. All right, well, let's get into this and let's learn a little bit about cycles. Wasn't really my choice. I got put on that by another company that I work for, and they wanted me up and running. Wait a second. There we go.
Which is a different type of rendering in Blender than the internal renderer that we've been using. So a little bit about Cycles first. Cycles is a different algorithm, so it's a different type of renderer, and for a long time in Blender, Blender only had what was called its internal rendering engine. And it wasn't bad, but it really was nowhere near as good as what you would find in the higher end 3D engines. Well, some nice folks came along and added some parts and pieces to Blender and created Cycles so that we can render light a lot more realistic. Now, the difference is the internal renderer in Blender, which we've been using, is basically just a direct light system. So it means that the light comes from a little kind of microscopic spot in space, and it lights one side of the object but not the other. Now that's not very realistic. You can kind of think of, if you're sitting in your office right now, if you closed all the windows up and turned out all the lights, it doesn't get pitch black. There's such a thing as bounce light. So light comes in and it bounces off of surface, and that's what makes nice reflections and shiny surfaces and refractivity and all sorts of stuff. That's much more realistic. Cycles takes this into account and lets us render something a lot more realistic looking in Blender than what we used to get with the default renderer. So another big difference is that Cycles is going to use your GPU. So this is going to get a little technical. And this is where Cycles starts to go a little bit wonky for some folks because, well, we all have different GPUs. Your GPU is your graphics card processor. And we all have different processors on our graphic cards, different graphic cards. Some of us don't even have graphic cards. We have graphics cards welded onto our motherboards. It all gets very fuzzy right around there. So what I'm going to do is show you how to set up Cycles so that it will render correctly. Hopefully take some burden off your machine and render faster. but also just some basics to Cycles. This image that I have here is rendered in Cycles right now, and something that Cycles does that's really neat that we're going to see is it is updating in the viewport, and then it will render. So we'll show you how to do that too. Okay, first I'm going to go and open this file that I had set up. This is one of the objects that we made earlier. Right now it's rendering in the default renderer in Blender, so nothing different than what we've been using before. So the first thing we're going to do to set up Cycles is we're going to go up here where it says Blender Render. That's the default, so that's that internal engine that we want to start getting away from, and we want to change this to Cycles Render. Now, if you don't see that little Cycles Render there, you do need to go to your user preferences. Remember, we've been in here. Go to add-ons, type in the search bar Cycles, and you'll need to turn it on. There'll be one add-on that'll come in. I think it's called something like Render Cycles, something like that. And turn it on. It might be because you were using an older version of Blender and you've updated, but by default it should be on. Okay, now the next thing we'll see is everything just kind of went kablooey here. We lost our textures, everything's white. If you poke around over here, especially in the render settings, which is this camera, oh my gosh, there's all sorts of new stuff in here. We've got samplings and all sorts of crazy stuff going on over here. Don't really worry about it too much. The default settings in Cycles will work really pretty well. We'll go over some of this in the later lighting classes, but for the most part, we're going to leave everything at default. So let's see what these cycles are doing. I'm going to go down here to my display method, and I'm going to hit rendered. Now at this point, it's just going to kind of look blah and gray. That's because we really don't have much in the way of light in the scene. Now you might be saying, but I have a light. I always had a light. I have this little point light. He's in there, and can't see him. But if we were to go, say, over here to a different setting, say, we'll go to solid. Well, there's my light, and if I move that light around, go back to, keep wanting to click on that, keep going to render, you can see it's changed the light. The lights actually do move, and you can go to G, and you can move that light around, and it's going to sort of light your scene. Now, Blender doesn't really work well with those lamps and point lights that we've been using. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to select that point light, and we're going to right click and delete it. And you'll see it really wasn't doing much good anyways. We could still see the object. Make sure that you don't have any other objects in the scene at this point. And we're going to add a light for Cycles. Strangely enough, Cycles uses objects for lighting. Alright, and for this I'm going to hop back out here to my solid mode, and I'm going to add in object mode, make sure you're in object mode, a mesh, and I'm going to make that mesh a plane. Now make sure you're not attaching this plane in edit mode or something different right now, because that's not going to help you. I'm going to make a plane. It's got to be a separate object because we're going to put a different material on it. I'm going to make this plane fairly large, mostly just so we can see it, and I'm going to move this over. And this is going to be our light. It's going to emit light from it. So if you're used to photography, this is like a diffuse shield that you might use in photography where you're trying to keep light from getting highlights. We can use it to bounce light, emit light. Basically, it's a great big square light bulb right now. I'm going to move that kind of up above my scene there. Okay, next with that light selected, I'm going to hop back over to my rendered mode first. We haven't really done anything yet. And then I'm going to go over here to my materials. Now we need to make a new material to put on this light. It can be a little tricky to figure out what's selected in Cycles mode. So just make sure that your plane or whatever it is you're calling your light object is selected over here. It's actually selected, it's just it's not going to draw those little orange outlines around it anymore. Then hit new, and you can see everything here has changed. Everything we're used to has changed. Oh no, it's all gone. Everything's changed. Got to learn something new now. And so these are the settings for the render cycles. And again, it's this button is controlling it. So these are all new. It's pretty simple. All I'm going to do is change the color first. I'm just going to change it to a little bit of an orange. You can see that it sort of changed there, but it's really not doing anything. The real magic is under surface, and right now it's under diffuse, which means it's just changing the color. If I click that, and go to emission, well, now it is going to emit that color light, and you can see it's starting to emit the light. Now, a few things are going on. You'll see this kind of graininess that's rendering, and then it kind of calms down after a couple seconds. Don't worry about that just yet. We're going to change that here in just a minute. So if it stays grainy, that's fine. If yours is even grainier than mine, that's fine. Just live with it for a few more minutes while we set up our light. Here's the strength, and you can see we can make our light brighter or calmer. We can turn it off completely. I'm going to make mine fairly bright just so you can see what's going on. And now I'm going to go back into, I always want to hit that button. I want to go back into solid mode. You see nothing's happening here in the other modes. That's pretty normal. I'm going to add another mesh. Now we could do this from the cycles menu, but you won't see the highlights and the transforms that you're used to. And I find that beginning students at this point get a little confused by that. So we're just going to add it here like normal in a different mode. And I'm going to take this, raise this way up here, and kind of point it down on our scene. Now that is a different object, so I'm going to go back into rendered mode. Click this. Remember, you can click them, so make sure that they are selected. There's my second plane. I'm going to hit new. This one I'm going to put a slight bluish light on. And that might be too blue, but we'll see. Change the diffuse to emission, and now you'll see that this side is getting that blue light. I'm going to really saturate this for a second so you can see that it is changing color as it shines down onto that pier structure. Okay, and at this point we still have a few problems. First of all, our textures disappeared. I didn't even mention that. So we got to get our textures back. But also we've got this grainy stuff happening. That's actually Blender set on too low of a setting. It's set that way so that it doesn't overburden computers that aren't particularly fast. Now, to make it render a little bit faster, a little bit of small print, your graphics card in your computer is going to matter at this point. And so your settings may look different than mine. I have seen hundreds of settings when it comes to getting Blender to render cycles correctly. If you don't see what I'm going to show you, just stop at this point, go to Google, check your graphics card, just put your graphics card in Blender, and just say, how do you get the cycles to render faster with that particular graphics card? And it'll tell you. The problem here is the interfaces are going to change depending on the graphics card. But here's how we do it. We're going to go to User Preferences, System, right here. And under System, we're going to go to Compute Device, and I think that is right down here. Yeah, under Compute Device, None means it's going to be set to your CPU, and we would like to use your GPU. Now, mine says CUDA here because I'm using a GeForce GTX 760. That's a CUDA Core GPU processor. And so I have this little CUDA button. You may not. If yours says GPU here, check that. And just make sure that you can set either your graphics card or GPU in this section. All right? And then say Save User Settings here. Once you do that, you should, over under your render settings, have some new settings right here because now it's looking for a GPU. So what I'm going to do is change this where it says device to GPU compute, and it will go much, much faster. Now that's totally dependent on what you're using. May not be as fast as mine, but it will go quite a bit faster. Now you can see it's much, much faster. Totally dependent on what we're talking about as far as hardware in your system at this point on how that's going to work. But at least it's a little bit faster. It's better than waiting for that to last forever. Now, let's talk about the sampling that's going on here. Up here at the top, when you're using cycles and you're rendering it in your viewport, you're going to see this path tracing sample. Mine right now says 10 out of 10. That was the default setting on mine. I don't know if that changes on other computers or not, but 10 out of 10 is leaving everything with this kind of salt and pepper look, or that sandy look. So we want to get rid of that. We do that by going to rendering, and remember, we already have to have this already set up. That's what I mean with cycles. Once you get it set up, it's fine, but getting it set up takes a little while. And then we're going to go under sampling, and it's these two buttons right here that we care about under samples. Under render, I'm going to bump up render quite high on mine. I'm going to go up to 100. And under preview, I'm going to make that 50. And watch that number as soon as I hit enter. See how it changed to 50? And now every time I move this around, it's going to render 50 samples. What's going on with cycles is it never really stops rendering until we tell Blender, stop sampling it. It'll just sample it forever. In fact, it would sample it for the rest of time. If you let it, it would burn up your GPU long before it got to that. But we don't want it to be too high, or you're really overtaxing your computer. And some GPUs can run very hot with this. Remember, they are running all the time. It's a pretty intensive process we're talking about. So don't go too high until you really see what's going on. But you want your rendering to be higher than the viewport, and you just want it to be at a comfortable position so that it renders pretty nicely. You can see here I'm still getting some speckling going on, but when we get over to rendering, which we're going to talk about in a different video, that speckling will go away. Alright, a few more things. We got to get our textures back. I mean, that's all we're doing on these things as we're making games, is putting textures on them, and I can't see them. So what we're going to do is click on our object. Now remember, you can click on things here in Cycles. It just doesn't highlight them. Make sure that it's highlighted up here. My peer is called Cube 000 and Cube 001, aptly named. If you want to change the names, you can. And then under, when one is selected, go to your materials here. And what we want to do is make a new material. So you can see there's a material on it, but it's not showing. I'm going to go ahead and delete that material. It's not going to hurt anything in my scene. Go to New, and then you should see these new settings here. That's the Cycles settings under Materials. We've seen that before. And under Color, I'm going to click this little dot right here and then choose Image Texture. It's going to change some odd color. Yours might not be purple. It might be something different. And then under where it says Open, I'm going to click that, and I'm going to click my material. And now you can see it has applied the material on here. I'm going to do the same thing over here with this other peer, or you can just apply the material that we just made, but it won't hurt me to show you this all over again. And ta-da. All right. Very nifty. A few other things here that you might care about. Under roughness, that is the amount of specular. So if the roughness gets higher, and it'll only go up to 1, then it basically is duller looking, more rough, I guess we'd say. Also, you can change the surface of your objects, not of your emission lights, but of your objects, and I can change that to be something glossy. Let's see. It will be glossy or whatever. You can play with these. There's a tune setting there if you want to use that. The default there is diffuse BSDF, and so that's your default setting, just in case you get playing with those and you forget what the default setting is. Now here I don't have any sort of object for my light to bounce off, so basically my light's just fading off into space here. In object mode, I'm going to go to mesh and create a ground plane, add plane, and we will scale this up. Yeah, let's go to, I'm going to go back to solid mode here just for a second. I'm going to make a great big ground plane. And we'll just lower that down here. Down here. I'm going to make that a little bit bigger. And what you're going to see is it is going to change the lighting a little bit because now we've got some bounce lighting happening. So we'll go back to rendered. And now we've got some light under here that's bouncing up from that surface. The more that you change the surfaces, some are glossy, some are reflective, all that bounce light's going to change. So your scene's going to constantly change now. But you can see we have a much better representation of what our object's going to look like than from that cruddy old internal render that we had. Now, one more thing, and that is if you want to change the background, just go to your World tab, it's this one here, hit Use Nodes, and then you'll see there's a color swatch that shows up here. You can just change the background there if you want. So it's not really going to affect too much in the way of the cycles, but you may want to do that when you're rendering pictures and all, just to make for a nicer background. I'm going to click on this plane up here one last time. Let's go over here to its settings, and I'm going to make that much more emissive. There we go, so that I can see that appear a little bit better. So that's the basics of cycles. Now, you saw a lot of buttons had changed in there. There's a lot to cycles. There's an entire course coming up that deals with rendering and making things look a little bit better and dealing with light. So we're not going to cover too much more at this point, but if you want to start turning in your work with cycles, you certainly can. Most of the work you don't have to at this point. We're not trying to create pretty pictures, but it certainly shows off your work a lot better. Welcome to Cycles.
Okay, sorry, that was the end of the video there. That was one of our videos for the course. It's edited, so the information's more condensed than the live. Let me get out of this. Okay. So the point of cycles is you just get a better renderer. Now, if you're not using one of the newer versions of Blender, you may want to update just for cycles because, well, it is better. But I don't use it a lot because it's just kind of overkill. I don't really need the objects to look great in Blender all the time. And a lot of times I'm taking the objects out to something like Quixel, which has a better rendering engine for games anyway. So it's up to you whether you want to check it. I'm going to jump over real quick to the chat room. And they'll just figure it out it's a video. So I have a button. Changes my voice. The videos are heavily edited. All the blank, I don't know what to do parts are edited out. Alright, well, that is going to do it for now. We are back tonight. But I don't know what we're covering. I'm looking it up. We are back tonight, and we will be covering... Oh, more UV Editor. Yep. We're going to be in the UV Editor tonight. We are off tomorrow and Wednesday. I need to make a trek up north and do some sound editing for another series that I'm working on. So, yeah, Tuesday, Wednesday we're off. And then Thursday we will be back in. And Thursday night we're doing the ZBrush sculpts. So keep an eye out for that. So that's going to do it for today, folks. I will see you tonight. Bye-bye.